The system is operational. Era, Achaemenid Persia, 5th century BCE. The institution, the royal Spada, the imperial army of Xerxes I, king of kings. Victim group, women of the Hellenic coastal and island settlements. Method, systematic appropriation, displacement, and institutionalized erasure as mechanisms of imperial subjugation. The sun over the Hellespont was not a warming light, but an instrument of measurement. It cast long, ordered shadows from the stanchions of the bridge of boats, a geometric scar upon the water, a testament not to engineering genius, but to administrative will. This was the year 480 BCE. The great king moved west. Our investigation does not begin on the battlefields of Thermopylae or Salamis. It begins in the silence that follows the marching columns, in the towns whose names are not recorded in the triumph stele. The Persian military machine, the Spada, was not merely a force of combat. It was a mobile institution of assimilation and control. Its needs were vast, predictable, and coldly bureaucratic. Labor for the baggage trains, service for the royal court and satraps, and human tribute to be redistributed across the empire as a demonstration of royal prerogative. When Xerxes' fleet rounded the coast of Magnesia, when his army marched through Thrace and Macedon, they did not pass through empty land. They passed through the world of the Hellas. Villages, temple complexes, family farms. The primary historical record, fixated on phalanxes and triremes, calls this foraging or securing the rear. The Crimson Archive reclassifies it institutional harvest. The targets were specific, not the male warriors. They were often dead, fled, or purposefully ignored to break the spirit of resistance. The target was the foundational unit of the polis, the hearth, the home, the women who maintained it, daughters, wives, priestesses of local cults. Their capture was not an act of random barbarity in the heat of victory. It was a procedural step. Surviving fragments, cross-referenced from later Greek lyric poets and tragedians, and contrasted with Persian administrative clay tablets noting gifts to the royal house, suggest a pattern. Scouts would identify a settlement. A contingent would detach from the main column. There was no siege, no heroic last stand for a fishing village. There was the sudden presence of foreign soldiers in precise, polished armor speaking in a guttural tongue. An interpreter, a Mede or a Lydian subject, would deliver the proclamation. The demand was framed not as plunder but as obligation, a tithe to the logistical needs of the great king's procession. Resistance meant immediate, total erasure. Compliance meant a curated selection. The selection process itself was the first mechanism of control. It was public. It was silent. Officers, not common soldiers, would oversee. They looked for health, for skill, potters, weavers, those versed in herbs were noted, and for equality the records chillingly termed sakta, unbroken. They were assessing structural integrity, not of bodies, but of future assets. Families were made to watch as their daughters were led to a central square, inspected with the clinical detachment of a man assessing a horse or a piece of furniture, and then divided into groups. Some were marked with a temporary die on the wrist, a bureaucratic tag. The emotional arc of this phase is one of paralyzing inversion. The familiar world, the laws of the polis, the protection of the gods, the sanctity of the home, was rendered null by the sheer, silent weight of the institution. The violence was not in the blade, but in the ledger. The horror was not in the shout, but in the quiet command. The women were not taken in the chaotic sense, they were processed. Their identities as individuals, as members of a specific family, of a specific deme, began their dissolution at that moment under that measured foreign sun. They were then escorted to the rear of the marching army. They did not walk among the soldiers. They walked within a designated sector of the camp followers, a supervised column. They were fed from imperial stores. They were given specific tasks, mending torn tunics of soldiers, grinding grain for the camp ovens. This was not kindness. This was the second mechanism, institutional embedding. They were made a functional minor cog in the machine that had consumed them. Their survival became tied to the machine's progress. By the time the Persian host reached the gates of central Greece, thousands of such cogs, harvested from the periphery of Hellas, were turning within it. They were the untold logistics. Their story is not one of chains and whips, but of a terrifying, efficient normalization. The brutality of Xerxes was not merely in the burning of Athens. It was in this calm, systematic unmaking of a world, one hearth at a time, recorded not as atrocity, but as inventory. The daughters of Hellas had entered the mechanism. The machine was running, and its deepest operations were yet to begin. The camp was a city of procedures. Our investigation moves from the point of harvest to the system of distribution. The institution, having cataloged its new assets, began its work of transformation. This was not accomplished through cruelty for its own sake, but through a relentless, impersonal architecture of reclassification. The Spada was a factory for producing obedience. The primary tool was separation. Bonds of language, kinship, and place were systematically severed. Women from Ionian Abdera were grouped with women from Aeolian Methymna. Dorian speakers from the Peloponnese found themselves alongside Attic refugees. The common tongue of their captors, Imperial Aramaic or the mediated Persian of the overseers, became the only bridge between them. Deliberately, the institution created a Babel, then imposed a single channel of communication. This was psychological isolation engineered at an administrative level. The physical space reflected this. They were housed not in dungeons, but in designated sections of the sprawling logistical camps that trailed the army like a second, slower shadow. These were complexes of standard-issue tents, arranged in grids. The grid is important. It replaced the organic, defensible layout of a Greek village, the agora, the winding paths, the family compounds, with a geometric pattern of control. Visibility was total for the guards stationed at the grid's intersections. Movement from one sector to another required a token, issued by a quartermaster. The space itself taught the lesson of permission. Within this grid, labor was assigned not by choice, but by assessed function. The institutional gaze had categorized them during selection. Now those categories became destinies. The weavers were sent to the textile workshops repairing sailcloth and uniforms. Those with knowledge of herbs or healing were attached to the Magi-supervised medical tents, treating the sores and fevers of the very army that had taken them. The young, the Sakta, were often assigned to the service corridors of the satrapal and royal retinues, bearing water, folding linens, maintaining the objects of courtly life. This was the core of the method, functional assimilation. Their skills, the product of their Hellenic upbringing, were co-opted to sustain the Persian war effort and courtly display. They were made to serve the power that had negated their world. Documentation was the institution's memory. While Greek sources scream of loss in poetry, the Persian system noted it in silence. Fragmentary administrative tablets from Persepolis, contemporaneous with the later years of Xerxes' reign, list allocations of grain and oil to Ionian women, Dorian women, women of the Sea Peoples, within specific palace or satrapal departments. They are listed as groups by origin, not by name. Their individual identities were submerged beneath a bureaucratic designation. They became entries in a ledger of imperial consumption. This erasure by record is a form of violence as potent as any physical act. It declares that your past self is irrelevant to your current function. Psychological pressure was applied not through overt terror, but through the constant demonstration of an alternate, absolute reality. The women would witness daily the immense, unchallengeable scale of the king's power, the endless rows of identical tents, the perfect synchronization of troop movements signaled by bells and standard-bearers, the awe-inspiring sight of the immortals, their numbers never seeming to diminish, and at the center, the distant, gilded seclusion of the king's own pavilion, a world unto itself, governed by rituals they could not comprehend. The message was implicit, omnipresent. This is the only reality that exists. Your old world is a memory. Its gods are silent here. Its laws are void. This system is eternal. Secrecy was maintained not by walls, but by distance and diffusion. A woman taken from a Thessalian village might spend the rest of her days in a Babylonian textile mill, or a Bactrian satrap's household, or the royal quarters in Susa. She would have no way of knowing if her sister, taken on the same day, was 2 tenths away or 2,000 miles east. The institution dispersed its human assets across the breadth of the empire, turning the vastness of Persia itself into a prison without walls. Escape was not merely a matter of fleeing a guard post. It was a geographical impossibility. There was no outside to return to, only more empire. The emotional arc of this phase is systemic dissolution. The self, defined by community and place, is methodically dismantled and replaced with a functional role in a vast, impersonal organism. Resistance was not met with spectacular punishment, though that existed, but with bureaucratic adjustment, reassignment to harder labor, reduction in rations, transfer to a more remote sector of the empire. The system absorbed defiance and metabolized it into data. The daughters of Hellas were no longer victims of a singular act of violence. They were components within a perpetual, cold engine of control. The machine was not brutal in its operation. Its brutality was its operation. It hummed with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. The war in Greece would end. The king would retreat. But the mechanism he set in motion along the coasts had its own momentum. It did not stop when the army crossed back into Asia. It simply moved into its long-term phase, integration, or more accurately, silent absorption. The army receded. The bridge of boats was dismantled. The great king returned to the heartlands of his empire, to Parsa, to Susa, to the carving of his triumphs upon stone mountains. In Greece, the cities counted their dead, rebuilt their walls, and began the process of crafting a memory of heroic stands and divine favor, of free men defeating the tyrant. This memory, polished over centuries, became the history of the West. But what of the harvest? Our investigation enters its final phase, the aftermath. This is not a story of liberation or return. It is a story of silence, of a void where a narrative should be. The institution, the Spada, had completed its primary function. The dispersed women now entered the custody of other institutions. The royal treasury, the satrapal households, the vast network of imperial workshops and estates. The method shifted from active processing to passive containment. They became part of the empire's demographic fabric, threads pulled from the Hellenic weave and rethreaded into the Persian tapestry. Their color remained, faintly distinguishable to a trained eye, but the pattern they now belonged to was foreign, eternal. The primary mechanism now was erasure through assimilation. Children were born. They learned the language of the household or the workshop, Persian, Aramaic, Lydian. They were given Persian or local names. They were taught the customs of their place of service. The stories of the Aegean coast, of olive groves and local nymphs, became half-remembered lullabies, then fragments, then nothing. A daughter of Miletus might raise a son who would become a clerk in the satrap of Egypt's administration, his only inheritance a certain cast of feature, a skill with numbers perhaps traced to his mother's meticulousness. The personal past was drowned in the cultural present of the empire. For those who remained in identifiable groups within palace complexes, their identity became a curated fossil. The Ionian weavers of the Persepolis tablets are a case study. They are a budget line, a department. Their Hellenic origin is noted purely as a functional category, a way to classify a certain style of textile production. They are institutionalized ghosts, their past useful only as a taxonomic label. Their lived experience, their memories of loss, are of zero archival value. The empire's records are concerned with output, maintenance, and order. Trauma is not a data point. The emotional arc here is resonant absence. The legacy of Xerxes' brutality against the daughters of Hellas is not a monument, nor a lament in the mainstream historical record. It is an echo in the negative space. It is in the demographic strangeness of certain Persian court listings from the mid-5th century. It is in the unexplained prevalence of Greek-themed motifs in minor arts of the Achaemenid periphery. It is in the profound, echoing silence from the women's side of the Greek historical tradition. When the poets and playwrights speak of the war, they speak of the grief of those who waited, Penelope, the women of Troy. They almost never speak of those who were taken. It was a shame too deep, a loss too complete to be woven into the triumphant national epic. Their story was an open wound the polis chose to bandage with silence. There is no closure. There is no moment of reckoning. No Persian archive will ever be discovered that says, "Here is the register of the women taken from the coastal villages in 480 BCE, and here is what became of them." The system was too efficient, too diffuse. It created anonymity as a byproduct of its scale. The true brutality, therefore, is exposed not in the act, but in the success of the erasure. Xerxes, Spada, did not just take women. It created a historical vacuum. It generated a population of ghosts who lived, worked, bore children, and died within the empire, leaving traces so faint they are indistinguishable from the background noise of history. They were unmade twice, first from their homes, then from the record. The daughters of Hellas did not vanish in a blaze of fire and heroism. They dissolved. Like salt in the vast, still waters of the Persian Empire, they lost their form and became part of the medium itself, untraceable, essential, and forgotten. The machine did not glitch. It ran its program to completion. All that remains for us, centuries later, is to listen to the hollow space where their stories should be, and to recognize that the coldest form of power is not that which destroys, but that which makes disappear without a trace.